Darragh, welcome back to the Freedom Pack podcast. It's a pleasure to have you back on after all these years.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It seems like only yesterday, but it was 3 or 4 years ago, is it?
2021, maybe, I think. So
That's a
yeah, good couple of years.
yeah, yeah.
Amazing. Well, I'm a big fan of your social media. Me and my partner do your quizzes every day. I'm not very good at them, but it's certainly given me an insight into the type of things you're interested in. So before we talk about all the science, I have a really thought-provoking question for you. What's your favorite Simpsons episode?
There is only one possible answer to this, and it's you only move twice. So I know that might sound like this is a precast question. This has not come to me before. I know the answer to this already. So this is when Homer goes to work for Hank Scorpio. I love everything about that episode. It's just so funny. I love Albert Brooks, the guy who voices Scorpio as well. It was at a point in The Simpsons where it was still brilliant and still funny, and they hadn't run out of ideas. And it's the whole, you know, the very idea that the Bond villain is actually a great person to work for
Yeah.
is epic, and Homer for once succeeds, and it all, of course, goes wrong for them, and they have to go back to Springfield. But I love everything. I love the little jokes. I love the Bond references. I love, the idea that the Bond villain is doing new age management speak, where we don't have corners here. They only have round offices. That kind of stuff. I just love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, a great episode. I mean, I love that era of The Simpsons. My top two probably for me, I'm thinking Flamin' Moe's, love that one, and Homer's Barbershop Quartet. Are you aware of that one?
Oh, the B sharps, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love it. I was so obsessed with that episode years ago. I custom made myself a B Sharps tour t-shirt. That's how deep I was into that episode.
I really like it in that episode when he throws his Grammy off the balcony and someone goes, "Oh, I just got hit by an award." Oh, it's a Grammy.
Yeah. Oh, amazing, amazing. Well, outside of The Simpsons, then let's talk about this book. Let's talk about
Yeah.
the subjects that you're versed in. So this new book, the aim of this new book, we talked about this before we hit record.
Mm.
Your aim is to sort of bring science to the everyday person in a digestible form, something I think is extremely important. I've spoken to so many science communicators on this show, Neil deGrasse Tyson being, in my opinion, one of the very best at that skill of communicating complex ideas in a very digestible manner. Who are some of your favourite science communicators?
Well, my absolute number one, and probably the reason why I got into biology and science, is David Attenborough.
Yeah.
I don't queue for anything. I am not a queuer. I hate queues. So, if there's a nightclub that had a queue and when I did that kind of thing, I just went somewhere else. But I queued for about 4 hours with my pregnant wife to get my David Attenborough book signed. I ended up having to go and buy like a folding chair for my wife to sit down in. And I queued when he did a book signing in Oxford. He's my absolute idol. I just think he's great. And a bit old school, this, not many people will recognize him. Well, a lot of people will, but younger people won't. Carl Sagan. I think he was great. I also really like Brian Cox's series that he did on the planets. I thought that was wonderfully accessible. I think he has that knack of having a sort of calm and progressive voice that just leads you through what should be very complicated, but makes it easy to understand. And like that's absolutely not my area at all. I'm not a physicist. I don't know very much about space, but I love watching those shows. So yeah, I think those sort of TV communicators are great. I also really like Julia Ravey. So she's on BBC Radio. I think it's Cambridge or something, but she's got great social media stuff as well. She does awesome stuff.
Yeah, a couple of months ago I saw Brian Cox live. I'm very similar to you. I don't know much about the subject. I consider myself an armchair astronomer. I just sort of like listening to people who know what they're talking about, whereas I don't know what I'm talking about. But yeah, these guys and yourself here with this book, I think having that skill of communicating ideas to the everyday person is so important in the way in which you're going to inspire people to grow up and be, deep thinkers themselves.
Yeah.
What I've also noticed in that space now with science communicators, there's a lot of different opinions around subject. Everyone has a voice now. Everyone has their own opinion. And there are certain topics where the topics seem quite black and white, but they've now become heavily debated. One that I'm thinking of is the idea of sleep. I've been sort of obsessed with sleep and reading about sleep for quite a few years. It came from reading a book by Matthew Walker, Why We Sleep. All these years later, I'm not entirely convinced and agree with everything that's in that book. But I think it did a good job in sort of catapulting the topic into the mainstream.
Yeah.
Do you think with sleep or sleep quality, do you think that's something we over obsess a bit too much about, and we've now overcomplicated quite a simplistic topic?
I think it's something that people are obsessed about, especially when you get to my kind of age, when you hit middle age and you naturally lose energy. You're not as energetic, your body doesn't work as well as you used to, there's more aches and pains. And I think we seem to think there's a magic bullet we can do. If we sleep in the right way, we will suddenly feel like we did when we were 20. And you won't, that just doesn't happen. So as an example, I recently slept in a tent on the ground and I felt like I had died the next morning. I felt like I'd been in a boxing match or something. And I used to camp all the time. I was in the scouts. When I was a student, I slept underneath a table on a kitchen floor and I got up feeling better than I did getting 8 hours sleep in a tent recently. So, there's that aspect of it. And the other thing is that we destroy any chance we have of having reasonable natural sleep with our lifestyle. That's just how we do it. And if you get into the science of how sleep works, but especially how sleepiness works, how getting tired works, and how it's dependent on, wavelengths of light that go into our eyes. And we just completely corrupt that system. We've got lights on in our houses, we've got TVs, phones, computers. We lie in bed in the dark with a backlit screen blowing into our face until midnight. And our brain is going, oh, it must be 6 a.m. And literally the chemical reactions in your brain all linked to the light that comes in. So yeah, I think we obsess about it, but partly it's unavoidable. But also there are very avoidable things that we do that make it worse, which doesn't help. So yeah, it's a weird thing, sleep though. Like, evolution is really, really powerful at removing things that should be negative for us. It takes a long time, but over like millions of generations, it culls out anything that's bad for us. But sleep, if you think about it outside of a human context, is the most dangerous time for most animals. They're literally unconscious. They can't detect any predators. They're not finding food. They're not finding mates. It seems like wasted dead time. But almost everything above a few cells in size sleeps. This is the really bizarre thing. And even things that are tiny, like microscopic worms, sleep. Fruit flies. I used to work with fruit flies in the lab. The circadian rhythms were discovered in fruit flies. So, and the people who did that won a Nobel Prize for it. There's no logical reason for sleep. Really, you would think at some point they would go, if any animal was able to remove it from their system, they would have a huge advantage over all the other animals. It's the most evolutionary pressure. Yet almost nothing has got rid of it. Everything sleeps. So it works at some really deep rooted level that living things, not just our bodies, but all bodies, literally need sleep to function properly. And yeah, and we don't know enough about it. I think there's not enough research into it. It's not very well paid. A lot of people would get research money on the basis of sleep deprivation and people who have problems sleeping, so sort of from a medical point of view. But actually, fundamental blue sky sleep is not researched enough. Well, that's what I think anyway.
Yeah, I mean, with this subject I mentioned there, it's heavily debated over, there's sort of like pop science books that come out on, and there's also this sort of biohacking side of the sort of sleep community now, where people are trying to sell you these gadgets they're going to be the magic fix to your sleep. There's infinite amount of blue light blocking glasses that from what I understand, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest they actually do anything, as Professor Russell Foster quite quickly taught me when I interviewed him. But yeah, I've read so many books on sleep that focus on that biohacking side. I mentioned Russell Foster there. He wrote a book. I'm just trying to find out what it's called. Lifetime. That's probably the best book I've read on sleep. But it's not that sort of high marketable book that promises you the answer to better sleep. It just actually digs into the science and sort of debunks a lot of the things you want to believe, like those glasses. So in sort of this biohacking realm of sleep, Do you believe that there are any of these tricks that actually help, or do you think they're simply marketing ploys, like the blue light blockers, for example?
The blue light blockers, those glasses, have no strong evidence that they don't work, but they have pretty much the same level of evidence that they do work.
Yeah.
So, but there hasn't been a huge amount of research into it. But any research that's come across has been either inconclusive or shown that they don't really make any difference. So there's a lot of conflicting things, and different wavelengths affect your brain in different ways and all that kind of thing. But most of the hacks don't work. If they did work, people would use them more. But I'm going to be very boring here, and I'm going to be very sensible. The number one way to do pretty much everything with your body is to eat properly, exercise more.
Yeah.
If you do those two things and reduce your stress, and exercise helps with that. So those three things will help keep you healthy, help you sleep, help you relax, help your mood, all of those things. So being outdoors, doing a good bit of cardio exercise, eating properly, you'll be tired. If you go out and exercise the amount that you're really meant to exercise, you'll be tired and you'll go to sleep. And now there's some people who have, disorders where nothing helps. And this is very general advice. Sorry, because whenever I say something like that, people go, oh, but I've got, this thing. So as a general rule of thumb, the answer to all of your problems is probably eat better and do more exercise. Unfortunately, as someone who hates exercise, it's...
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? I think that, if there was, say, a magic pill that were to give me the benefits of regular exercise, eating healthy, all these good habits you talked about that people don't want to do, people would pay astronomical amounts of money for that pill rather than actually going and doing the work themselves. And I think that's the big problem here.
Humans like convenience above everything else.
Yeah.
So this is something I hold to very strongly. If it's easy, they will go for that. That's what they will go for. And disregard everything else, whether it's healthy or good for them or better even. If it's difficult but better, most people won't go for it. It's how humans work. We go for the easy option. And it's the same, actually, it links into science communication. The sort of myths and, nonsense that people peddle, they make it nice and easy to believe. They go, this is definitely this. Whereas scientists would say things like the blue glasses. There's no real strong evidence. It doesn't sound like we're saying they don't work, because we don't like making definitive statements unless there's fairly heavy proof. So the easy lie, the easy thing to do is always easier, and people just go for that.
Yeah. This is such a big market for those things, and I think if you look at the biohacking longevity community, I've interviewed a couple of the guys from that community that are quite controversial, and there's a lot of debate around them. And these are people that are obsessed with the idea of living to, well, one of them claimed he was going to live to 180 years old. He thinks he's got the formula. Now, the question I pose to him is, one, are you scared of death? And two, if you have to live such a sort of rigid protocol, to where I think the biggest example, I don't know if you know Bryan Johnson is. So Bryan Johnson, if you look at his protocols, he's someone who lives from the outside looking in quite a sheltered life, spends most of his time, in his house, or he's got very rigid rules around his routine, and doesn't really do much outside of the goal of prolonging his life. Now, it's that balance between, trying to follow these protocols and prolonging life, and actually forgetting to actually live itself. What's your view when you look in on the longevity community? Do you find it an interesting place to look at?
I think as a psychological and social experiment, like nearly as a human zoo, it's interesting to look at people who believe this. So the biggest issue I have with this is they think everything is under your control, and it's not. So you can definitely live a lifestyle that increases your odds of living longer. Again, if you eat healthily, if you exercise, if you de-stress, if you, don't expose yourself to carcinogens, if you don't smoke, if you do all of these things, you are giving yourself more tickets in the lottery of life. But it is a lottery of life. And part of it's a genetic lottery, which is completely out of your control. And another part of it is fundamental to how we live and how our cells survive. So one of the things in the book, one of the things that I talk about is why do we get older? Why do we age? And part of the problem is how our DNA replicates. So every time our DNA replicates, every time a cell divides, it actually cuts off a tiny piece of our DNA. And this is just inherent to how our DNA works. The process of copying itself and making a new copy for a cell shortens the ends. And that's fine because our DNA has a kind of built-in, kind of like extension at the end, like the cover on your shoelace to stop it fraying, called a telomere, right? And telomeres are not needed by your cell. They're there as protection for your DNA, and they get shorter every time. And once they go, that cell's finished. It can't divide anymore. And it goes into what's called senescence. So senescence is where it starts to die off, its functions go down, and that's kind of contagious. It doesn't infect, but senescent cells cause other cells nearby to go into senescence. So no matter how hard you work at it, no matter how much you stay in your house, no matter how much, wheatgrass shots you take, there's a ticking clock that's unstoppable. And no one's figured out a way to stop it yet. And if you try and mess with this, it can have disastrous consequences. So a lot of people are doing research into this to try and figure out how to prevent senescence happening. But tinkering with it can very quickly cause cancer. So, I'm sure at some point in our further evolution with, scientific advances and things, we'll probably crack some way to either change this or slow it down. But right now, every human has a ticking clock that you can't stop. You can't slow it down. That's happening. So there is a maximum end that you will reach. Now, whether you actually reach that maximum end or you finish yourself off before you find, that's the bit that you can extend. But there is a limit. There's an upper limit, and I think 180 is probably beyond the range of that limit so far. This is why we age. Like there's no biological sensible reason for bodies to age. It doesn't make sense from an individual's point of view. So it would be better for the species if we never aged and we only died when we were killed off. Much better survival, keep reproducing, all that stuff. But it's not even how our bodies work, it's how our cells work. We can't escape it, unfortunately. Time is a harsh mistress.
A lot of what you mentioned, this is a lot of what a good friend of mine, Dr. Andrew Steele, talks about. He wrote a book called Ageless. He's a longevity researcher, but a very realistic one, and debunks a lot of the sort of mad scientists out there trying to live to 200 years old. So back to sleep then. In terms of the body, so you mentioned there, the idea of why we need to sleep is very sort of a bit of a mystery. It doesn't really serve an evolutionary purpose. So what goes on in the body and the brain whilst we're sleeping? What's happening?
But quite a lot does, actually. And this is something that's kind of confusing to people. They think it goes dormant. Your brain does not go dormant when you sleep. It's still really active. One of the main things that happens is that we dream. And without dreaming and without entering dream sleep, we quite literally go insane. Your brain stops functioning. And they can't really study this because in order to put people into that level of sleep deprivation would be like completely unethical. It would like, you can't do it. So most sleep deprivation studies stop after 2 or 3 days. But if you go further, if you ever see anybody who does, it drastically affects them. So you lose cognitive ability. It's basically like being drunk. You can't function properly. But inside your brain, lots of things happen when you're dreaming. And one of the main things is consolidation of memory is what they think happens. So you have these images and sensations, and your brain it doesn't stop working, but it goes into a neutral gear. So the engine's still running, but your body doesn't react. So this is why, you don't act out your dreams. And that's obviously very good evolutionary. If we were up in a tree and you started acting out your dreams, as our ancestors did, that's terrible. So it's a way for your brain to process information and memories without your body being interactive with. So that's one sort of section of why we sleep. The other one is down to basic housekeeping. So your brain is very, very active all the time when you're awake, and it's processing information, and it has to use that time to react to our environment. And sleep gives it an ability to be in a situation where it doesn't have to react to the environment. So there's a big thought that it actually cleans itself. So there's a really good study that was done, I can't remember who did it, where they did scans of people's brains when they're sleeping, and it washes with fluid, with spinal fluid and cerebral fluid. So they think it's actually washing out the brain, maybe removing misfolded proteins like prions and things that can cause CJD or mad cow disease, that kind of thing, or just generally sort of having some downtime for maintenance, which is probably where I would lean towards the main function of sleep. So if you don't have that, if your brain constantly runs, then it's not able to maintain itself properly. So, and you can't do that when you're awake because you need your brain when you're awake to be focusing on other things. So it just has to have, it has to have time to go into the depot and get cleaned up and stuff before you load it up again the next day.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned about memory there. I read something on this before, and I've always found it certainly true in my case. When you're trying to learn a new a skill or a new pattern or sequence, like a Rubik's Cube, for example, and you're sort of drilling that over and over and over, and you're finding it difficult to sort of remember the pattern. If you're doing that up to the point where you go to sleep, when you wake up the next morning, you're more likely to have remembered that pattern. I find it the same with when I'm trying to learn things on the guitar. You sort of get to that frustration point, and then you wake up the next morning, and suddenly it's a lot easier to remember that pattern. Is that a case of like new pathways forming and things whilst you're asleep?
Well, the new pathways like synapses would form well before you go to sleep. And that's actually really quick. Your short-term memory is in terms of seconds, not in minutes. So anything that would require new synaptic growth would have happened already. But it's probably down to sort of consolidation of those synapses, linking them to other things in your brain, chemical changes. It's an extremely complicated. Like I worked on fly brains, which are like several orders of magnitude simpler, and they're wildly complicated. So so in a human, it's much higher level, but what is clear though is things like if you're cramming for exams. I had a friend who thought that pulling an all-nighter before an exam was a good idea.
That was me.
Never a good idea. It's never a good idea because you don't actually remember all of the things that you do, and all you do is poison yourself with fatigue, and your brain will start to misremember, and it will actually start to remember the wrong things as being correct. So you become so confused from tiredness. You need sleep. So you're actually far better off if you are studying, getting your rest in, doing it repeatedly. You will be better off going to sleep and getting up early in the morning and doing another run to consolidate than you would staying up all night and going into your exam sleep. So yeah, it's difficult with a human brain because it's so complicated to nail down exactly what's happening. And the kind of experiments that you would need to do will be wildly unethical. So you kind of have to do it from a degree of removal, which makes it tricky to understand, but we're getting better. We know a lot more about the brain than we used to.
So another sort of major topic in the personal development space at large is brain health, brain deterioration. Now, I followed you on TikTok. I can see that you have a very similar taste in books to me. I've got an entire shelf up there dedicated to Tolkien. I've just started the Wheel of Time series. I love all that deep fantasy.
I'm almost finished. I've just spent, I think, 3 months rereading them. I'm on book 14 for the second time. I'm about 200 pages left. Yeah,
amazing. Well, I'm only on the first book, so I hope I've got some good books to come then.
Yeah, well, there are some good ones, but I do have to warn you, there is a distinct dip in the middle of the series. I think it coincides with the author. He became quite unwell,
of course.
And they kind of drifted a bit, and the plot didn't advance. So you'd read 700 pages and go, actually, not a lot has happened in there. So, yeah, a lot of words were used, but not a lot. The plot didn't progress, but it does pick up again at the end.
Oh, I'll look forward to that section then. But yeah, I try to read. I read non-fiction, but I'll try to read fiction as well in sort of place of things like doom scrolling on my phone, or even if it's fiction, I'm not necessarily learning anything practical because somehow it still feels like it's better for me. Is there any credibility to the phrase sort of use it or lose it when it comes to saying mentally sharp in your later years, even if you're just doing things like reading fiction?
Yes. Yeah. It's not supremely clear, but there's fairly strong evidence that people who are more likely to read, to do crosswords, to be active, physically active. Again, I hate to keep coming back to it, but people who exercise, their brains stay better, lower stress. But yeah, if you're the kind of person who is that kind of mentally adapting themselves and not just doing passive activities, you have a slight increase in your chances of keeping going. But it's so complicated because humans are complicated. And if I was doing a science experiment with flies, I would have it very well controlled and there would only be one variable factor. But there's always lots of factors for humans. So the question is, is it because you are a cleverer person or a smarter person or a more cerebral person who did this all their life? And that's why you have a higher level at the end, is because you had a higher level at the start? Or is it like a muscle, where you just exercise it all the time? And that's very, very difficult to pin down. But on big mass studies, so if you look at like huge studies where they look at lots and lots of people, it tends to be the people who are more active mentally maintain that a bit later. But again, like all of these things, if you're struck down by, Parkinson's or stroke or dementia, all bets are off. It's completely out of your control.
Of course. So, in terms of reading, then, are there any other benefits to reading? Because there's a lot of sort of pop science around this topic. I saw on TV the other day on the One Show, actually, there was an author on there saying, and the quote he said, "Reading fiction for 5 minutes a day is scientifically proven," was the words he used, "to increase empathy, reduce stress, and improve mental health." Now, I'm not sure what the metric is on that last one, but as for the other two, is that believable to you?
I think this is based on a sort of fairly small study, so I wouldn't disbelieve it, but I wouldn't say it's definitively proven. So again, I think the problem with this is that they gave people, they probably gave people a book and got them to read for 5 minutes and gave other people a phone and then measured, like, how do you measure empathy really?
Yeah.
That's a very difficult thing to measure. You do that by survey. You go, how do you feel about this? And it could be that, the act of reading makes you answer questions differently rather than genuinely feel empathetic. So the controls of those experiments is always difficult. So it's dubious at best, but I would think that if you are more mentally active in general, I think that's going to change how you feel and view and think. I wouldn't be surprised if that's true, but I don't have any strong evidence for that. Yeah. I think passive activities where you're watching things that you're not thinking about. So if you're watching, bubblegum TV, or you are, like you said, doom scrolling at like people, I don't know, picking up cakes or something on social media, or, weird sort of memes and things, there's only so much of that you can do where you're losing something, so but then the idea that reading fiction or nonfiction, you can read terrible fiction. I know it's an active thing and that helps, but you could be reading really, really the equivalent of doom scrolling. You could be reading that in text. Yeah. So it's going to vary wildly from person to person. It's going to vary wildly depending on what you're reading or what else you're doing. People who are watching TV, if you're watching Only Connect or an insightful documentary or some brilliant movie, that's not going to be that's not going to be terrible for you. You're not going to turn into a monster who's non-empathetic, Or if you're reading some like trashy novel or something like that, isn't going to automatically make you into a better person. So, yeah, I would want to read the study that was based on before I drew any conclusions. But I would say skepticism is best there.
Yeah, I agree. Are you worried at all about advancements in technology and artificial intelligence in terms of making it easier and easier to avoid things like critical thinking or even everyday decisions? People these days, they'll use AI to plan their entire meal plan for the week, their shopping lists. I'm not thinking of it in terms of this entirely big intervention that's going to kill our brain function, but rather something that could sort of just chip away at our cognitive function over time. I think it was Joanne Hari wrote a book called Stolen Focus. You've got things like TikTok that are great platforms. I mentioned earlier, I use TikTok. But features like the infinite scroll or the way that the algorithm works, they've almost come to hack our attention span now. If you're not hooked in 2 seconds, you're suddenly just completely disinterested and it's on to the next. And there's infinite possibilities. And with AI, the need for creativity, I think, seems to diminish. For instance, before we came on, I just out of interest, I typed into ChatGPT 10 great questions to ask Darragh Ennis about science and the human body. And it gave me 10 interview questions to ask you specific to your life and the work you're interested in. I didn't use them, of course, but my job could have been done in less than 10 seconds. So what effect do you think all of this will have on our cognitive function, if any at all?
I think there's there's sort of two ways to look at this. You can look at the negatives, which people tend to, because it makes better copy to be negative.
Yeah, of course.
So you can say, humans will no longer do art. We will no longer make decisions. We'll end up like the people in Wall-E, where we'll just sit around and the computers will do everything for us. And to some extent, you know what? That's true. But the other way to look at it, and the way I would like to look at it, because I tend to be a positive person, is to look at the boundless opportunities this could give us. So AI could free us from having to do everything. So we currently, every time any new technology comes, you look through history, anytime when the printing press came, steam engines came, there was always people going, this is the end of humanity as we know it. We'll get lazy. The machines will do everything for us. When dishwashers were invented, they said, women will do nothing else. All this stuff, it does happen, So I think we'll expand our world to do it. And there's always going to be a sub proportion of people, and it happened before AI, who genuinely go, this is brilliant, I can do nothing, I can sit back and kick back, because people love convenience. But I think there'll always be humans who want to strive, who want to do things. And if we can use AI in the right way, we could, work less and think more. We could be more creative. We could do new things. Working 7-day weeks, 12 hours a day was the norm a couple of hundred years ago. That was absolutely normal. That's what everybody did. And weekends made a difference. They changed how we do things. Holidays appeared. You could go away for the weekend. And people went, in the UK, they went to Blackpool, and that only happened because of reduction in work. If we don't need to work, but we do the things we want to do, I think there's an opportunity there, certainly for a subsection of the population, to genuinely blossom, because they've got this load taken off their shoulders and they can be as creative as they want to be. Because, what if AI made it so we only had to work 3 days a week and we had a 4-day weekend? How awesome would that be? And not just from now I can sit around doom scrolling and like playing PlayStation and stuff. I mean, how awesome would it be that you could spend the majority of your time doing what you want to do rather than the minority of it? Yeah. I think there's an opportunity here that everybody passes by, whether they're looking at the downside of it. I think we can have a new type of world where huge amounts of our work is done, our productivity is massively increased, and we can produce enough in a smaller amount of time that we can have more free time to be who we really are.
That's a very good way of looking at it, and quite, not something many people talk about. As you mentioned there, it's quite, people tend to look at the negatives. They tend to talk about how AI is coming to take your job. That will, of course, generate the hits. But the way you were speaking there reminded me of another guest we had on last week, Professor Neil Lawrence from Cambridge, who talks about AI. And he talked about it in the sense of, he used this example of the coin pusher method, in which, we're told that AI is going to come and take all our jobs. Well, in fact, it's probably only going to replace some of the skills that were already on the edge anyway. It might knock those off, but it's not going to knock all those coins off that have been sat in the machine. So it's not something we need to worry about as much as, we're told on, these big YouTube videos that we see popping up all over the place.
And in science, the opportunities are immense. So one of the biggest problems we have in biology is the size of data sets has increased massively, absolutely massively. We've gone into genomics and proteomics and things where you're looking at the entire genetic information of not just one individual, sometimes entire populations, because we're able to sequence things so much better. We've got proteomic studies where we're looking at the protein content of entire cells or parts of cells, and the amount of information that we get back is so large. It's effectively useless. So right now we employ, bioinformaticians who are impossible to find because they're so needed, and not enough of them are being trained to filter and to try and find patterns in that. If we can have AI tools so that every scientist at the bench can lower the activation energy of accessing that information, we could make scientific research massively more efficient, hugely more efficient on a massive, huge scale. And the medical, even if we don't, I never tend to look at the medical side of things. I always want to know how things work and why they work. But the medical implications of that are huge. If you could genuinely bring in properly working, well-developed AI tools into genetic medicine, that could be a huge game changer. It really could. And it might get us to living to 180, that might be what it needs. So we shouldn't have to do everything by hand. and we very readily adapted using spreadsheets and using programming to do things. And then we used machine learning, and machine learning was going to end the world 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I think artificial intelligence has its limitations that people don't seem to realize, but it really does have vast opportunities. And we should go, do you know what? Let's look at those opportunities. Curtail the bad side. They do exist. Make sure it's not a threat or a danger. Make sure we don't, overly rely on it, and we don't sort of gatekeep it and keep it under control. But look at the opportunities. They're vast.
I think that's a fantastic way to frame it. Yeah, most of the time when I ask that question, I get the opposite answer. So it's refreshing to hear that other side of it. I appreciate that.
The negative sides are valid.
Yeah.
They are very valid. There are genuine dangers. If we hand everything over to algorithms, everything, and we don't have any input into it whatsoever, that's potentially disastrous. You have to make sure that it's regulated and all of that kind of thing. And, it is going to change. It's going to change certain things. Like, teaching is different, and it has to be different. How we teach in schools has to change. Giving a student an essay to do is an entire waste of time.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
Because all they have to do is, if they put it into ChatGPT, the new one, and they just use all the information and tinker with it a little bit so it passes, there was this done by ChatGPT program, they could have their 5-page essay done in like 15 minutes. So why not use that? Why not go, okay, it doesn't matter where you source, it doesn't matter what you do, but you have to verify everything, check everything, make sure it's correct, and go and teach them about the dangers of it. When it first came out, I did do a bio of me in ChatGPT, so a couple of years ago, because some of my friends are really up on this, on a few computer scientist friends, and it was complete nonsense.
Yeah.
It made up stuff. It said I won the Irish version of University Challenge, which I didn't, and it was never in it. They also got the name of it wrong. It said that I was, I won a quiz championship that doesn't exist. It said that I did, I did a degree in Trinity College, which I didn't go to. All this, it just condensed things down. My friends, bless them, I love these guys, sowed disinformation on my Wikipedia page when I first became famous. So they put a false birthday. My birthday is not in September. Everyone thinks 27th of September. It's not. Complete nonsense. So my friends made that up, and I have a fake birthday that I get like celebrity websites telling me happy birthday, and it's not my They said I was of Turkish descent. So ChatGPT,
I saw that on your Wikipedia. Yeah.
Absolutely not. Like, you have to go back 4 generations before any of my family leave Dublin. So all of this was farmed by ChatGPT, and it started talking about my family in Turkey and all this kind of stuff. Complete and utter nonsense.
Wow.
So when we're teaching people, let's go show them how it works, show them how it doesn't work, show them when to use it, how to use it, and use it as a tool. Use it like the internet. When I was a student, we were not allowed to use the internet. We were told Wikipedia is the devil because it's made up. And now Wikipedia is a very solid source of information.
Yeah.
Let it adapt and let people use it, and show students how to use it. That's the way to do it.
Yeah, I was wondering about the Turkish descent. Actually, I did see that this morning.
Complete nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, ChatGPT, it has told me some tremendous lies about, I put this show into it. I said, tell me about the Freedom Pack podcast. It told me my 3 biggest guests were David Attenborough, Joe Rogan, and Elon Musk. And I thought, well, if that was the case, I'd have a bigger YouTube channel than I do. So, take that one with a pinch of salt.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned this in passing earlier, that you've done a lot of work with fruit flies, insects. What is the process like then to use flies to study memory? How do you measure a fruit fly's memory?
Well, we looked at it on a molecular level in my lab. So we actually looked at it as, did the synapses grow? So we watched them. So we were able to, we couldn't do this with any sort of higher animal. We were able to open up a fly larva, so a caterpillar, like a maggot, and open it up. They're really small, by the way. And you can sort of stimulate them chemically or electrically, and you can manipulate their genes, and we could see what happened to new synapse growth. So they would physically grow within a very short period of time, and you would see them, new ones appear, and we would be able to measure that. So we were able to actually not just go, what do you think about, what's your memory of this? We were able to go, okay, boop, there's a new neuron, there's a new synapse grown. So that's the equivalent of a memory. So we were able to use that as a model for memory formation. So there is that, but there are studies where they study what they remember. That wasn't what we did in our lab, but
Yeah.
they did things like they would associate a particular smell with a positive or negative stimulus. And then they would give the flies options. They'd put them in little glass tubes that have like, Y junctions, and they put the smell out in one of them and they go. And if they got a positive stimulus, say they got some food at that end, then the next time they would go down that end straight away. And they'd measure how long, or how their decision making process basically. And if they switch the stimuli, how long would it take them to swap? All things like that. There's plenty of, quite neat and clever experiments that people have done.
Am I right in thinking? I think the sea slug seems to have had a major contribution to the sort of understanding of learning and memory within humans, right? That's one of the ones that pop up a lot when I looked up memory.
Yeah, it's something that it's a very good model because it's very quick to respond. It's at that threshold where it's complicated enough to have a reasonably like large, complicated brain with different sections, but simple enough that doing experiments on it isn't too ethically challenging. You can keep it in a lab, which is, I know that shouldn't be the major thing, but the fact that it's able to be kept alive in a lab is a huge bonus when you're studying things, so you don't have to go out into the wild to study them. And it has quite complicated responses to things, so you can have lots of different outputs to your data. So it's a good model, and a good model is everything. But people think that they're really far apart from humans. Some of them aren't. The way that our cells work and our brains work is remarkably similar, actually. So if you have a fly that you mutate the gene, the equivalent gene that causes Parkinson's in humans, it'll shake. It gets tremors. So exactly the same sort of output symptoms. And if you feed them the drug that you give humans, the tremors stop.
That's wild.
So it's the same chemical pathway. So it's preserved. Like we're tens, more than that, hundreds of millions of years apart from the fruit fly evolutionary. God, that's hard to say. Evolutionarily apart. So on the tree, we're miles apart. But how our neurons work and how our brains work at a deep fundamental level is really similar. And that's bizarre, but true.
Wow. So on fruit flies, we've hosted, I think now 5 Nobel Prize winners on this show. So this was really interesting when I heard this. You said that, I've heard you say that the humble fruit fly has led to 6 Nobel Prizes. Yeah. What is it about the fruit fly then that's so special? And what is it about them that warrants their study this much?
So part of it is that even though they're very different to us, there is a similarity there. So that helps. The other one is that their genetics are really easy to manipulate. So it makes genetic experiments really simple. They've been studied for a very long time. So they were one of the first animals used in genetic studies. So they have red eyes normally, but a subsection of the population have white eyes. And the person who studied that, that was one of the realizations that genes are on chromosomes. So that genes are carried on a particular chromosome. That experiment, the key experiment, and that was done on fruit flies. So because of its history and its ability to be manipulated. So one of the big problems with larger organisms is if you mutate a gene, if you give them a mutation, very often that causes cancer or non-viability of the organism. It just never develops. But in fruit flies, you can do something that's called balancers. So this is where you've got 2 copies of a gene and you can scramble one of them, and it means that it has to use the one that you've given it because the other one's completely scrambled. And if you do that in most other organisms, it doesn't work. But for flies, for whatever reason, it works. So it means that you can have a mutation in a line of flies that's stable, even though it's not good for the fly. So normally what would happen is you'd throw it off and use the other copy. You get rid of it, you'd lose the mutation. But you can keep fairly dodgy mutations for the fly for tens, hundreds, even thousands of generations. So you can have stocks. And what that means is there are stock centers. So they're talking about AI and stuff. There's one in Bloomington in Indiana, there's one in Kyoto, there's one in Vienna. These are fly centers with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of different genetic mutants of flies. And they use robots to tilt them onto new foods. They're really cool. You should look them up. And if you want a particular mutation, you just order it and it gets delivered in the post. So it's really cheap, really easy to use genetically. The overall cost of fly research, the basic cost of it is quite low because keeping rats or mice is very expensive. Ethically, they're nice to use, because they're small flies. And there's a huge community around the world already working on it. And they're very cooperative because that step away from humans actually makes them much more cooperative. I know that sounds weird, but a lot of people who are working on direct medical research have a lot of pressure from, they're partnering with pharmaceutical companies, or they're trying to to get down the route of working on cures. It's very competitive. There's lots of people working. The fly community really isn't like that. We all work together. So if we found out another lab around the world was working on what we were working on, we would phone them up and go, okay, how are we going to split this? Let's publish it together. Let's trade reagents. We never said no. Anyone ever asked us for our antibodies or flies, we always sent them, and it was the same. It was reciprocal around the world. So all of that together makes them such a nice organism to work on. Really does. They're brilliant to work on. Great community, and big advances have been made in the field already, which also helps.
Wow. Sounds like a good community. A lot of the scientists I've spoken to always talk about the politics of academia. It doesn't seem to be the case in your field then.
Well, the academic side is always political. That's always a problem. But in the research side, the fly community is absolutely brilliant. The fly and the worm community, so the C. elegans, the nematode, they're all of them. I've gone to conferences. We all get together. Everybody shares ideas. It's a really the best way to do science, actually, because it's actually more productive. People think competition makes you more productive. It doesn't. Collaboration does.
You mentioned Parkinson's as an example. So they're a good model for understanding disease too, right? Yeah. So what are some of the ways, or what are some of the things in relation to disease they've helped us to understand?
Well, they've helped us quite a lot in general, understanding how things work on a fundamental level, which helps. So sleep disorders, the whole circadian rhythm thing was completely done in flies, and that's one of the reasons why they got the flies were used, is because it's so easy to use, and it's just means that we're able to understand fundamental processes of organs. So we know, if you know the basis, if you know the first step, you can reduce the amount of energy that's taken at more expensive science. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So if you say, one of the things we did in my lab was we wanted to figure out genes that were involved in memory formation, and we studied hundreds of them, 1,200 all at once, labeled the RNA and the protein, did it in brains, throughout the whole nervous system. If you tried to do that in mice, it would cost hundreds of millions of pounds, and it would take, probably at current levels, probably around 70 or 80 years. We did it in a few years for a fraction of that cost. And because of that, we were able to filter. So we've been able to show, okay, out of the 1,200, X number are useful. X number are really promising results. And when we published that, we put all the data out there. We hope that somebody who works in higher up models, so somebody working, say, in mice or rats, goes, actually, do you know what? Instead of doing these 1,200 and not knowing what we're doing and having a guess, let's have a look at 5 of these 20. And then they can do that. So it's a way to reduce the dependence on more expensive, more ethically difficult to use animals, but still maintain the integrity of it's actually quite similar. And that's a huge advantage.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense to me. So as we start to wrap up now, get into the final questions, just to sort of round off this topic before I move into the questions we ask every guest. Yeah. This is in relation to your book. And again, I will leave the link in the description for everyone to check out the pre-order. What is one thing about the body, about the human body, that you think everybody should know?
Well, I think I've mentioned one already, about that there's a ticking clock. But if I was to pick one, I think everybody really, really should know how our body defends itself and how medicines, particularly vaccines, help that process. One of the most distressing and disturbing and horrific things from a scientist's point of view, in my opinion, in the last few years, is the anti-vax movement. It's beyond the scope of madness. The most effective tool we've ever had, the only thing that has ever eradicated a human disease, the billions of lives lost that have now been saved. If you go to a churchyard that has graves from before vaccines were developed, look at the age of the children who died compared to now. And then because one greedy scientist was trying to sell a different type of vaccine, and he made something up, which he has openly said, I won't even mention his name. Yeah. He has openly admitted that he lied because he was basically bribed to do so. And then we now have the resurgence of diseases like measles, which are not a joke. They're a very serious disease. So if anybody could take anything out of my book, it's to read that chapter about how our body defends itself and how vaccines help that. The only thing they do is help, because I find it absolutely horrific that that level, that tiny piece of misinformation has grown into such a powerful movement.
Yeah.
That kills me.
Yeah.
Sorry to be very serious, but
No,
that
it's extreme. No, I think it's an extremely important point and brilliant answer, and one I agree is going to be highlighted in that section in your book, which I encourage everyone to go and read. So thank you for such an honest answer. I really appreciate that. So as we start to move then into the sort of final questions, I ask every guest just a couple of questions before we let everyone know where they can find this book to pre-order. The first one then, we've talked about your book today. We've mentioned a couple of other books, and this can be non-fiction, it can be fiction. What are some of the books that have had the biggest impact on Darragh Ennis throughout his life?
So weirdly, very few of these are science books. So I read a lot, and I used to read a lot more than I did because I'm busier than I was.
Yeah.
I reproduced and things. It eats into my time. But there was a point when I used to read 2 or 3 books a week. So I moved to Canada and for 3 years, and I had almost 400 books by the time we were moving back that I couldn't ship back because they were too expensive. But yeah, so I've been very heavily influenced by again the David Attenborough books. My dad had Life on Earth when I was a kid in the house, and I read that tons of times. So that would be the big sciencey one that would have got to me. I read the Discworld books by Terry Pratchett, and I loved those books. And there's ethical things in there, and there's ways of thinking about the world. And then the other one, and this is going to be not someone that anybody has ever really read, but my dad, when he grew up, was a big socialist. He was very left wing. And there's a book called The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists. I know that sounds like a bonkers title, but it's about a group of sort of laborers and painters and workers in England in, I think it's the 19th century. And it's an explanation of how they're being exploited by their greedy bosses. And I think my politics are largely directed from talking to my parents and reading that book. So that one had a very profound influence in turning me into a horrible lefty who but he deserves a fair shot.
Oh, amazing. You mentioned Terry Pratchett there. It's something Discworld, something I've been meaning to get to. I've picked up a couple, never read one, but I've spoken to a lot of people online in that sort of book community because I love authors like Tolkien, Robert Jordan, Brandon Sanderson, and everyone tells me you have to read Terry Pratchett. So I look forward to reading them if they're that good.
They're very different. They do not take themselves seriously at all. So they're not that epic heroic, they're the opposite of epic.
Isn't it doesn't it sort of all take place on the back of a moving turtle or something like that?
A giant turtle called Great Atuin with 4 elephants on his back and a disc on the back of that. And it's what he says, it's the most unlikely world that you could imagine, so it only exists at the very edge of the universe where that kind of thing is allowable. And it's very, very good. He also wrote a science book, actually, or 2 science books called The Science of Discworld, which used the narrative sort of framing of the Discworld to explain scientific concepts. So the wizards in the university find a mini universe, and it's our mini universe. And instead of flat worlds on turtles, it's everything seems to form balls and go in circles. They're fascinated by this.
Amazing. So this is just me going off on a tangent now because I'm interested. But in Discworld, am I right in thinking someone told me you don't have to read them in any particular order? They all take place within. Yeah.
So there's chunks of there's sort of sub themes within them. So there's ones about the guards, the police, the night watch, and they assume at least a reasonable knowledge of the earlier ones. So, and there's ones about a group of witches, which is, originally sort of, they don't necessarily have to be read in the same order, but it makes more sense if you do.
Yeah.
But in between them all, and if you bounce from one to the other, largely they make sense. But it helps within the themes. If you read the earlier ones first, it makes it easier to understand what's going on. But it's not a continuous narrative. It's just character development continues throughout. So you could definitely dip into the middle one and not miss anything. But it's probably funnier and makes more sense if you read the earlier ones.
So if I had to read one to start, what do you recommend that I read?
I would say read Guards, the first of the Night Watch series, and then read through them. So guards is the basic concept of it is that they live in this massive city, and the leader of the city has decided that the police are useless, and he just officially recognizes the Thieves Guild and the Assassins Guild, and they keep peace using much more vicious things. And the useless guards are down to the last couple of guys who don't really do anything, and they end up being the heroes of the story when a dragon invades. And yeah. So the ones that know everybody discounted become the heroes, and that's very typical in Pratchett's books. It's like it's the slightly useless person who ends up winning usually.
Yeah. Well, sounds like my cup of tea. I'll pick that one up. Thank you for
Yeah.
that. The final question I ask every guest on the show, no matter what the topic, no matter what area they're from, right now for Darragh Ennis, what makes life worth living?
Everything. How can people not love life? I don't, like again, I might be wild, I might be the only optimist in the world. Life's wonderful. I woke up this morning, it's sunny outside. I had a really nice breakfast, lovely pastry out in the garden. I got to talk in this podcast. I'm gonna go, bring the dog for a walk. We get a little over 86,000 seconds a day, and they're gone. If you got £86,000 into your bank account every morning, but it was gone by that night, you would spend every single one of those pounds every day. Seconds are more valuable than pounds. There's the life is out there. I love life. But then I have a great life.
Yeah.
I have a wonderful job. I have a wonderful wife. But I love it, and I always have done. I think it's great. I think be optimistic. Don't squander your seconds, and just go and enjoy it. So there's nothing in particular. I think life's great.
I love that. I love that answer. It's one of my favourites I've ever had in over 300 episodes, and I'm a lovely sentiment to finish on. I'm certainly going to enjoy the sunshine. It's very rare in Wales, so I'm going to go from here. I'm going to go play some golf, connect with some friends, and then enjoy the rest of the day.
Sounds like a wonderful day. I'm going to get a nice cold drink, and I'm going to sit out in the shade and read some Wheel of Time because I've got 300 pages left, or 400 pages left. I need to get that done. It's like a monkey on my back at the moment.
Yeah, they're quite the task. But that sounds great. So before I let you go, please let everyone know where's the best place they can go to right now to pre-order the book. I know I'm going to go away and pre-order the book straight away. Where can we all go?
So it's called The Human Body, 10 Things You Should Know by me. You can order it pretty much anywhere you like. So it's on Amazon, it's on Waterstones, it's on bookshop.org if you look there, and that gives money to your local bookshop, which I would also recommend. And on the 26th of September, it'll be in shops everywhere. If you can't be bothered finding that and you follow me online, the link is on all of my profiles.
Amazing. And I'll leave it below. And your social media, where can we find you? Bones Giles, right?
Bones Giles. It's a childhood nickname, and I made my social media accounts before I became famous, and my agent was always telling me to change it to Darragh Ennis or the real Darragh Ennis. I'm not changing now. So at Bones Giles on everything.
Love it. Love it. Well, everyone can connect with you there. Darragh, thank you so much for coming back on. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you again, my friend.
Great. Thanks for having me.